Greetings, music nerds, and welcome to Season 8 of the Music Makers and Soul Shakers podcast. This season is brought to you by our newest sponsors, Larrivee Guitars and Fishman Amplification. I'm your host, Steve Dawson, coming to you from the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. This season, I'll be taking you on a journey down the many rabbit holes in the process of making great music. I'll be speaking to instrumentalists, songwriters, producers, up-and-comers through legendary veterans, and we'll go deep into their history and their process of creating unforgettable music. This show continues to be listener-supported. You can help keep the show going with a one-time donation or a Patreon subscription. And when you sign up for Patreon, you get an ad-free version of the show, as well as getting entered to win some killer prizes from our sponsors at the end of the season. We have an incredible Chase Bliss Lossy pedal up for grabs, as well as a Fishman acoustic guitar pickup and effects pedals, as well as a pedal from Union Tube and Transistor, and more. You can get links to all this and sign up now at makersandshakerspodcast.com. Meanwhile, many thanks to the sponsors for this season. Please check them out and let them know that I sent you. They are Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Hen House Hang. All right, thanks for tuning in, and let's get down to it. Howdy, music nerds, and welcome to episode number 170 of the podcast. On the show today is a fixture on the Nashville music scene and a great keyboard player and a good friend, Jen Gunderman. Sorry to miss out on a week there a couple weeks back. I was just buried in work and travel and just couldn't get an episode together. So I skipped a week and now we're back on track. Thanks for hanging in there with me. And I was in Vancouver doing the pop-up session, which we've been doing, which was a ton of fun. It's where me and my band set up shop in a studio and songwriters drop in for an hour and we knock out a song and mix it for them. And it's a blast. We've done it a few times in Vancouver. We've done it in Calgary, and we're going to do it again. So check my website, stevedawson.ca, or the new thehenhousestudio.com, which has info on all that stuff. And another one is coming up in April, and you can get on it if you're interested. Also coming up is the Hen House Hang Mixing with Steve. That is my 2-day mixing course here at the Hen House in Nashville, where we talk about nothing but mixing. I realized after doing a few Hen House Hangs that the mixing part was just a lot more information than I could pack into the amount of time we had. And so I decided to have a separate event that was focused just on the mixing. So that's what we do over 2 days. And that's in March of 2025 in Nashville here. And it is open to 5 people only. And those 5 spots are now up for grabs over at thehenhousestudio.com or stevedawson.ca. You can find all the info. So come join me. It's fun. And thanks to a couple of new Patreon subscribers over the last few weeks, Mike Compton. I wonder if that's like mandolin Mike Compton. Probably not. Although you never know. That guy's great. And David Falkowski. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate that. It keeps the lights on, as they say in the biz. And that brings me around to the last little bit of business, which is, as I tell you every week, if you do sign up to the Patreon, you are automatically entered into our year-end draw. You just have to be a Patreon subscriber for as little as a couple bucks a month, and you are automatically entered. And the draw has all kinds of cool prizes, like a pedal from Union Tube and Transistor, a pedal from Chase Bliss Audio, all kinds of cool stuff and some swag from different sponsors. There's some pedals and some other very cool DIs and stuff from Fishman, as well as Spectra 1964. So hop on that train, help me out, keep the show going, and also win some prizes for your dang self. All right, so Jen Gunderman is on the show today, and she's someone that I've had the pleasure of working with now and then over the past number of years, always in the studio, although she plays live a lot. But I've only worked with her in the studio. And in fact, she's been out touring the world this year on a crazy tour with her longtime employer, Sheryl Crow. She's been opening for Pink. And that is a very elaborate, crazy stage show with all kinds of acrobatics and whatnot. And I think it can only happen every few days for technical reasons. So I think that Sheryl Crow and her band have been flying in and out between shows, which seems crazy, but that's the way they're doing it, I think. So that's her life right now. But Jen is a super pro player who always shows up to a session with great ideas and raring to go. And her path to this point in her career is a really interesting one. She grew up playing piano in church, made her way through college and had a stint working for the last gasps of the late 80s, early 90s major label scene, working at the offices of Columbia Records/Sony Records in New York from 1992 to 1994, right in the last gasp when those companies had tons of cash and were tossing it around like maniacs. So she did that for a while, and then she was wise enough to jump ship. She did see that ship was sinking and landed an amazing job as the keyboard player for the Jayhawks, who many people will know. She spent a couple of years with the Jayhawks touring and recording, and eventually she landed in Nashville with her husband, Audley Freed. And Audley is someone that's been on the show before. He's one of my favorite guitarists here in Nashville. And he was playing, his band was called Cry of Love. And I think that she worked with them through the label. That's how they knew each other. Anyway, they got married, moved to Nashville, and both pursued various musical endeavors. And she found her way into doing a lot of session work, and she landed a cool job teaching music history at Vanderbilt, which she continues right through to today. And she's been in Sheryl Crow's band, touring the world for over 10 years now. And you know, that Sheryl Crow band is one of the best bands going for a major artist that I've seen in a long time. It's like a no-frills rock show with no weak links in the band. Everyone in the band is spectacular. Fred Eltringham is the drummer, and he's been on this show as well. So the band is Jen and Audley and Fred and some other folks who you'll hear about. And Sheryl Crow seems ultimately loyal to them as well, which is a great thing to have in a boss as a musician, having a reliable boss that's going to hire you over and over again without being weird. Jen's a killer piano player, but also knows how to lean into a B3 with the best of them. She plays a mean Wurlitzer, and she can also come up with wildly creative soundscape parts as well on various other keyboards. Her studio career has taken off over the last couple of decades as well. Ever since moving to Nashville, she's been recording on albums for artists like Kris Kristofferson, Roger McGuinn, Willie Nelson, Loretta Lynn, the Dixie Chicks, St. Vincent, Emmylou Harris, and lots more. So you can get all the latest info on what Jen is up to and her past endeavors over at Jen Gunderman. That's Jen with one N, jengunderman.com. And now enjoy my conversation with Jen Gunderman. You're involved in a lot of stuff, and you've been doing a lot of touring and recording and just cool work in general for a lot of years. But there's not a lot of information out there, but you're a little bit of a mystery. As is Audley, actually. Like you guys are both like a bit of the mystery couple of Nashville.
Audley is almost impossible to find online.
And you are too. Like you do have a website, but it doesn't reveal a lot.
That's true. It's kind of just like a landing spot for, I don't know, basic information.
So the thing that I notice, or the thing that I know about you too, is that like education has always been a part of what you do, whether teaching but also like you've spent a lot of time at university and getting degrees. And I know you got an ethnomusicology master's.
Yes, that's right.
But then it just seems like you're suddenly in the Jayhawks.
Well, it kind of did happen that way.
We'll come back to like really early, I guess, but like that college education for you. Tell me, so that was like you were in Washington or something, or?
Well, I was in Topeka, Kansas. My dad was a church worker, and I went to high school in Topeka, and I knew from a young age that I could get good grades, and I knew that that was going to be my ticket away from Topeka, and I knew that I wanted to have adventures in the world from a really young age. And so
like musical adventures or just
not necessarily adventures. Like music was my thing. I loved piano so much. I asked my parents for piano lessons when I was 5 years old, and they sat me down and explained to me that they could not afford, because I had also said I wanted to be a ballet dancer, the way that every 5-year-old girl does.
Yeah.
But they sat me down and they explained.
Another expensive hobby.
Yeah. But I mean, I think I'd had ballet lessons for like, a week or two, and I decided I want to also do music. And my parents sat me down and explained that they could not afford dance lessons and music lessons, and I was going to have to choose if I was going to be a ballet dancer or a piano player. And I remember just
at 5 years old.
At 5, and I remember thinking this is the most profound decision I was ever going to have to make in my life, which it kind of turned out to be. And I decided to quit dance lessons and become a musician. And so from a really early age, like I I did attach to music, and I loved it so much. And
like you felt like you wanted to be a musician when you were 5.
Yeah, because I had a kindergarten teacher who played piano, and I just thought she was a dream. And I thought also that music was magic because she had taught us this song called 50 Nifty United States that taught us to sing the states in alphabetical order, which I can still do to this day. And I remember thinking that like all the kids in the class could now name all 50 states in alphabetical order. And it was music that had done this. And what is this magic? And plus, like, my dad's family was very musical. And I used to think that, like, all families sang 4-part harmony after dinner. They were, like, German Lutherans who would have, like, Vespers, after dinner or something. And we would sing, like, Bach chorale type 4-part hymns.
That's intense.
And yeah, but I thought everyone did this. And so it was definitely, in the family, but nobody was, like, professional about it, but it just got me, I'm sure the same thing happened with you.
It did, but not till way later. Like I wasn't 5 when I was making those kind of crazy decisions.
Yeah.
Like, did you even know that was something that you could do as a living?
No. In fact, I didn't know that until I was 35, probably.
You're still trying to figure it out.
Yeah. No, but I did know that like there were women who played organ at the church, and they seemed to, and I knew that there were people who conducted choirs, and so my experience with like people doing it professionally were mostly like teachers and church workers.
Yeah.
When I was really little, I had no conception that.
So did you see yourself playing organ in a church or something?
Yeah. And in fact, that's I think what my father thought I would do, like right up until I went to college. I think that was kind of his vision for where I would be going. But it was definitely not my vision for what I wanted to be doing.
Did you do a little bit of that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I started, like, my first gigs were in church, like, at a very young age because my dad would pitch in and lead, like, do weddings and funerals. And so I played, tons of weddings and funerals when I was probably starting when I was 11 or 12 years old, like playing the preludes and the offertories and postludes and the.
Why wasn't the church organist doing those gigs?
Well, she was oftentimes, but it was a larger congregation, and so there were a lot of weddings and funerals, and like she couldn't do all of them, and so when she was unavailable, my dad started asking me to fill in.
Wait, was your dad
So he was,
pastor or whatever?
Kind of. He was what they called a DCE, a Director of Christian Education. And so it's a job that only exists in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And it is basically like a second person who comes on after the pastor to lead like the Sunday school programs and the youth group programs and the, all that stuff. So he was like the number 2 in charge pastor type person, although he did not go to seminary. So he wasn't ordained, but he could run a funeral. And so
he could rock a funeral with
he
the
could
best
rock
of
a funeral, and he had a beautiful singing voice. And so so people oftentimes liked for him to do those services because he was kind, and he had a beautiful singing voice, and so he could do the chants, and he could even sing whatever people wanted to hear at the service. And so I would sometimes accompany him, and we would get it done.
So how'd you learn to read? Because you'd have to read to do those.
Yeah, well, I did start those piano lessons at 5, and it was a traditional like classical education, and I was really serious about classical music all through, like up through college. I majored in classical piano studies like as an undergraduate, and graduated like having focused on that.
In Kansas?
No, I won a scholarship to go to Vassar College in upstate New York, and I studied classical music there. But I knew even like as a teenager that I wasn't a good enough. I didn't have a good memory, and I wasn't good at being perfect, and so I was never very good at like memorizing the big, like large works of classical music, and And so I knew, even though I had won this scholarship to go to school, that that probably wasn't going to be something I'd be good at. But it got me to New York, and it got me a really good education, which is what I wanted. And so I thought that I would go to law school, really. Like, I thought that I would, like...
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. That I would, like... Because my family didn't have money. And so when I got the scholarship to go to Vassar College, and my grandmother had been an immigrant. She came through, like, Ellis Island, and the rest of my people were, like, German Lutheran farmers, and, like, none of my grandparents even finished high school because they had to pitch in and work on the farm. And my grandmother worked in a factory in St. Louis. So that was part of the reason why I valued education so much. It was like that really like immigrant mentality. And so I made it to Vassar, which is a great school. And I understood that being there meant that I could change my fortunes, and the fortunes of my family. And so I thought that it was sort of my duty to...
What was the path with classical piano? Like getting a gig in an orchestra or something? Or like what? It was
going to be... I mean, before I stopped going to church, it was going to be, maybe being a church organist or, like play the Bach, preludes or whatever on an organ, like maybe study that was kind of the thing. I wasn't like thinking so much about a career. I just loved music and I was trying to be as good at it as I could. And at that time, the options, in Topeka in the 80s as a teenager, there weren't like bands to play in,
Was there none of that going on? Like you didn't have any friends that were playing in bands?
After the fact, actually, like one of the guys that was in the Jayhawks told me, there's a really cool like rock and roll scene in Kansas, right? And I was like, really? I had no.
You were just a nice little church girl. You had no clue.
I had no clue at all. Like,
is Topeka a tiny town? I don't know it.
Topeka is not super tiny. It's had about 100,000 people for a long, long time. It's
farmers. It's
the capital of the state, but it does not have an airport.
Okay.
So it's like a pretty insular place, even though it is like the seat of government. It's a pretty unusual, town.
Wow.
It was a sweet place to grow up. But like a lot of places in the Midwest, it's got challenges right now. Those Midwestern cities are.
Is it got like opioid problems and stuff?
I'm pulling for it, but it was. I knew that I wanted to leave. I knew I had to leave if I was going to have the adventures. That I don't know.
So you pretty much like spent your childhood there. That like you didn't travel much.
No, actually, like I was born in South Florida in Fort Lauderdale, and then my dad got a call to a church in. That's what they called it.
Got the call.
You got the call. Yeah. From God, to go to Conover, North Carolina. And
we shouldn't laugh at that.
No, we shouldn't. But like, here's why I'm laughing. Like, I'm not saying that God didn't call my dad, but what I am saying is that it was hilarious because the church would be like looking at resumes and then would decide, would pray on it and then would like decide to offer the job to somebody and they would call it a call. And then the person on the other end of the line would like decide whether it was a true call. And so my dad would like also pray on it and then determine whether it was true that God was asking him to go to this place. But, he was also looking at the school system, the district, but like it was kind of tough for my mom because of course, like if God calls you to do something, you can't.
What are you going to do?
Yeah. What are you going to do? So anyway, he got a call to go to Conover, North Carolina. And so I was like, preschool to second grade in like a very small town in North Carolina. And then he got a call to go to Friendswood, Texas. And so I was like outside of Houston, Texas, from like second grade to sixth grade. And then I was in Kansas from 6th grade through high school.
Mm-hmm. And did any of that Texas music seep into your life in any way when you were a kid there?
Man, I knew I loved Texas when I was small. And it's funny, you look back now, like I still love Texas. I think that children know, you know what I mean? I knew that there was something about it that I connected to. And I like North Carolina quite a bit too. But Texas, man, I hated to leave Texas. And there must have been, like, it was still like a very churchy environment, but there was like a ranch next door to the church. And I learned to ride a horse, when we were living there. And, the church camp that I went to was like near LaGrange, where ZZ Top,
Sure.
So there was like a, well, and there was this combination of kind of like cowboy stuff and, the public schools in Friendswood, Texas taught like a lot of Texas history. So you would hear a lot of like Tex-Mex type like music and stuff, even like in school. I remember like playing some of that stuff. And it was an awesome place to be a kid. And NASA was really nearby too. And so and this was like the era of the space shuttle. So it felt very exciting. And a bunch of our neighbors worked at NASA, and the guy a couple doors down had been there in mission control when they landed on the moon. And so like that place for a kid, just, I don't know, it just felt like
kind of magical.
There was like horses and outer space
people.
And yeah. It was great.
Wow. So was your musical situation then strictly piano, or were you playing or like reed or like what are those called, the big church organs?
Yeah.
Were you playing those too?
It was mostly pianos, but because I was there all the time, like the organist would oftentimes like let me sit, and like I remember not being tall enough to reach the pedals, but like like pulling out the stops and like playing around with the manuals and understanding at a really early age that like there was a whole different playing technique that goes with organ versus piano. And that was interesting to sort of get in my brain early on too. They were like magic people, the people who knew how to like pull and push all those crazy buttons on.
Give me that layman's crash course in what's going on with. So the stops are just tonal variations. They're like it's essentially like the Hammond organs.
Kind of
drawbars, sort of.
Well, sort of. Yeah, they're turning on and off the pipes, basically, like different collections of pipes.
Which is giving you overtones, or it's giving you volume, or what?
Both, and so there's a collection of pipes that are typically like in the back of a church, like behind the choir, and and so they're not drawbars, the pulls. I mean, I'm not a professional church musician, but this is what I understand is that like the different levers and pulls turn on and off different sets of individual pipes.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can mix combinations of pipes by pulling and pushing and get like a big, fat, louder sound because there's just more pipes, going at the same time. Or you can like push them in.
It's very three-dimensional and cool.
Yeah. And loud, powerful too.
Yeah.
That was my first experience with just like body shaking, because my parents both sang in the choirs up in the lofts. And so the kids would always sit in the back row right in front of the pipes, and so it was very loud, and very
That's powerful.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's foot pedals similar to like a B3. Is that what's going on?
Yes.
So they're playing bass notes with your feet.
Right.
Okay.
And good. I'm not I can't do that well, but like the really good players can, play melodies and like counterpoint and with their feet.
And did you learn some of that stuff too? For the Bach stuff that you were playing on?
Just like super basic. I was never very good at it, but they explained to me like the heel toe technique that you're supposed to use or whatever. But I'm not any good at it. But it was fun to try.
Is it laid out the same as those B3, the ones that are sort of splayed out from?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's the similar.
Yeah, similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never sat behind a church organ, so I don't
You would
know
love it. It's a powerful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially in a beautiful room, ideally like a cathedral type place.
Did you have any exposure to music outside of like church music?
So it's funny you ask, because like when I lived years after this time, I was living in New York and with some roommates and like in Manhattan, and Footloose came on, that movie.
Yeah.
And I had never seen it because I was not allowed to see it because it was
the subplot was like
it was my story.
Right.
Like I was like, my roommates fell out laughing at me because literally it was the story that I had grown up with in Kansas. So I went to like a super conservative school where we were not allowed to listen to rock and roll. And
that is the story of Footloose.
yeah, we were actually not. So we instead, can't believe we're talking about this, but there's other interesting things. But anyway, they, instead of having like a dance like a normal middle school, we would have square dances. And so I heard some like bluegrass style, like square dancing music or whatever. Mm-hmm. For some reason, they felt that square dancing was more chaste, I guess, than like, But of course, when you're in 6th grade or 7th grade, like it became like just as fraught as anything else would have. You know what I mean? So we like were really psyched when it was square dancing lesson time because it meant that we got
whipped up into a frenzy.
We did a square dancing frenzy. But thank God there was no Missouri Synod High School in Topeka at the time, so I had to go to a public high school because there was no secondary education that was Lutheran. And so starting age 14, I was in a secular environment. And so in high school, everything started kind of
revealing itself.
Yes.
Okay.
And
what was your
Prince? I loved Prince. Okay. Yeah. Like he was my guy.
That must have blown your mind, your little churchy mind.
Yes. I loved him so much. And there was all that,
what else?
80s new wave. Well, I remember I really did not like John Cougar Mellencamp because of that song called Jack and Diane, where he basically says, like, this is as good as life is ever going to get in this little town with this little, and I was like, you're wrong, John Cougar Mellencamp. I know there's like something better out there. And the funny thing is that like years later, I played a gig like that I guess it was Farm Aid. Like we played at Farm Aid and John Cougar was there and he played that song and I was standing on the stage and I was like, see, John freaking Cougar.
You don't know what you're full of shit, John Cougar. Full of it.
Like you were wrong with that Jack and Diane. I got here, So yeah, I remember I did not like that song. But it was like a lot of like music that you would drive out to the lake, and like go water skiing, Foreigner in Kansas and Boston and like all of those kind of like AOR like bands. I was kind of learning about them. I had some guy friends who liked Rush, and
a little Canadian rock.
Yeah. And then all the new wave type stuff. And also I was like falling in love with, this is back like when they still did the Columbia Tapes and Records Club. And so I like the first 2 cassettes that I ordered from them when I joined them was like Beach Boys and Aretha Franklin.
Whoa, yeah.
And so I started like hearing.
Were you making that connection of like Aretha's music to the church music? And I mean, it's pretty different from
because
the church music.
Her church was so much hipper than mine was, and so I did not recognize it at all.
Okay,
but and that kind of like not recognizing thing was something that I laugh about now because I think now part of the reason I love Prince so much is because he had 2 women in his band, Wendy and Lisa, and I loved his music, but I couldn't hear, I didn't understand at age 15 or whatever that like the synthesizers that I heard, that it was keyboards, that I could do this. Like somehow I didn't make the connection that what I was doing playing Brahms on a piano was like somehow transferable. Or that was lack of imagination on my part, or just like too big of a wall culturally maybe. So for the longest time, like the sacred and the secular stayed like pretty
It was just something you listened to and loved.
Yeah.
But you didn't put it together.
I didn't make the connection. I mean, I started.
And nobody ever said like, hey, you play some pretty mean Brahms. Can you do this in our band?
There was no.
Really?
Like, I joined the high school jazz band, and so I started learning how to read a lead sheet. But even that was like, Maynard Ferguson and Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And like, so I started to learn about that stuff. And
that's a bit of a mind expander too,
I
though,
loved
right?
it. Like, yeah, that was like, and also.
What about improvising?
It was an ass kicker. I could not improvise. Like, I had only ever read, and
it's hard for people like that grow up in your kind of way of learning.
It was
suddenly improvise, right?
Yeah, it was terrible. And I had worked so hard to be good at playing piano. My jazz teacher in high school recommended that I try out audition for like the citywide jazz band thing, and so I went to the audition, and the director of the whole thing was like, "Oh, we're just waiting on the piano player." And I was like, "Well, I play piano." And he kind of looked at me like, "Okay," And so I sat in and kind of stumbled my way through some of the changes or whatever. And then this girl came in who had grown up playing in a church like Aretha Franklin's church, and she proceeded to sit down and rip it up.
Really?
And she was 16 and had clearly grown up playing in a hipper church than mine, and rocked it out. And I had never seen anybody
just on the piano.
She was well, she played with the band, and they were doing some kind of Count Basie style thing. It was blues, jazz, R&B type.
That's a whole vocabulary that you just didn't
and
have.
She was just no, and she was my age, and she was kicking my ass, and And it was just beautiful. And I remember being so embarrassed, first of all, that I even said I knew how to play piano, because I should have just kept my mouth shut. But it was great. I mean, I think a lot about how important it is to have your ass handed to you,
Yeah.
And that was the first real ass kicking I received.
Did it make you want to learn what the hell was going on and get in on that action?
Yeah, I was like, what is this, and how did she find this? And and so I started to, not how did she find this, how do I even meet another person who can play like that? Because it wasn't around really.
Was she at your school, this person?
No, it was one of those. It was a pretty segregated city, and so she was not.
She was just gone.
Yeah,
she was there.
Yeah, never saw her again.
Whoa,
yeah,
crazy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. For a minute, my parents took me to lessons with a black trumpet player who lived. Literally on the other side of the tracks. The Santa Fe Railroad went through Topeka, and he was a brilliant jazz musician, and he tried to teach me a little bit about that world and how to improvise and stuff. But at that, I was so far behind. He was talking so far over my head.
Oh yeah.
But
did you have theoretical knowledge, or were you just reading so strictly that it wasn't even seeping in yet?
There was a lot of theory that was part of the classical training, for sure.
Okay.
And then that translated over pretty easily to the jazz.
Yep.
At least the theory part of it, if not the actual,
Yeah. Were you picking up on piano players that you dug? Were you hearing jazz that was exciting you?
I love Count Basie. I love Duke Ellington.
Were you figuring some of that stuff out?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I tell you, I loved Aretha Franklin's piano playing to this day.
That movie that came out 3 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Amazing Grace, the making of the. Yeah. No, she was
crap. I knew she was good, but
she is so good.
Yeah.
She's so good, and I think the fact that she was the greatest singer that ever lived kind of obscures the fact that her piano playing was completely
badass,
mm-hmm. Incredible. Yeah. So I have spent a lot of hours trying to.
And how did you take to learning that stuff? Were you actually transcribing solos?
Yeah,
stuff
well,
like that?
not in high school. It was it was in fits and starts. It took years before I could really like hear and like, play back something like that. It took a long time to work away from just a pure visual. So in the beginning, I was having to write everything down, like, on staff notation,
Oh, really?
And, to try to like understand what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Did you get into any jazz situations where you could play that kind of music? High school jazz band?
Yeah.
That was kind of it?
Yeah. Well, and because then I went off to college, and I continued to be really serious about studying classical music. Mm-hmm. I forgot a whole another thing that I was doing this whole time too was my little brother had a beautiful singing voice and liked acting, and so he got involved in like community theater in Topeka. And so besides playing at the funerals and the weddings, like my other first gigs were at community theater, like accompanying the actors. Yeah. So a lot of what I was learning also had to do with like sight reading, like Broadway score, like piano reductions, and like sometimes I would be put in charge eventually of like rehearsing the actors or rehearsing the cast, and so I'd done a lot of musical theater, like from the pit, like playing in pit orchestras. And so by the time I went to college, I had done a lot of that. So I was like directing, like being music director for like shows,
Okay. That's a cool skill.
Yeah. I sometimes think it would be fun to like get back into that. But so like my freshman year, I like did West Side Story, and I was conducting from the pit, and like so there was like that to me was like an easier way to expand my vocabulary in the with that Bernstein stuff, which has all that jazz and Gershwin and
that sort of newer American repertoire of tunes and
and then there was like Kurt Weill and so it was quality stuff. It wasn't so much like Rent or it was like classic stuff.
That's good stuff to wrap your fingers around.
Totally. Well, and I think that like,
and there's a good dose of jazz in there too.
It's a good dose of jazz, and it honestly helped a lot with my improvisation too, because some of the piano reductions are not very well written, or they're not at least written.
What does that mean, a reduction?
So like if you are going to do West Side Story, you're not going to have like the orchestra at all of the cast rehearsals. And so there's a score that you get. It's called the piano reduction, which is like all of the instruments-ish, reduced down to something that a piano player in theory can play to get you through the rehearsals. Yeah. But the piano reductions are not always very musically written because it's not what the composers...
Right. It's not the intention of...
Right. It's just to get you through rehearsals. So I started being able to discern that like the piano reductions were not always the same choices that I would make, if I were trying to like get my way through the score. And so I started... That was really helpful, actually. I learned a lot about improvisation and about like accompanying singers and like holding out... Like, I don't need to play the melody with my right hand. I should be focusing on the groove. The singers will respond differently if I just ignore that part of the score and do this instead. So that was a really great thing to learn. And I think helped me think differently about what accompaniment meant and what, like, when to ignore the page and when to, like, pick up something from it and to do it, like, in real time, Yeah.
So all the way through that era of college for you, like there was still no like band situation, or you weren't playing with like songwriters or anything like that?
Well, I did a production of Hair, and that's kind of got a semi like 70s rock and roll kind of score to it. So we had so much fun doing that show that the band from the pit decided to put together a real band, and I was dating the guitar player in the band at the time, and we took a couple of people from the cast and we made a disco cover band, and that was my first like band, and we were called Fine Wine, but with a WH, like, And we actually ended up like gigging around campus and gigging like at other campuses around like the Hudson Valley in New York.
So the college is where? It's like up.
It's in Poughkeepsie, New York. It's about like 2.5 hours north of New York City on the Hudson.
So that's cool. So did you leave that area at all, or you just stayed in that region?
We didn't tour like outside. I mean, we were still in school, and so we couldn't like leave for very long. But we would have like weekends, where we would play like a party at another campus.
So what would you play? What instrument would you play?
There was a kid on campus who had a Rhodes that
okay.
Well, now that I say that, I think it was a Wurlitzer, actually. Yeah, it must have been a Wurlitzer. And so that was like the first, but I was broke. I couldn't buy a Wurlitzer. And so
did you think a Wurlitzer was cool? Like,
I loved it. Oh,
okay.
God, I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved the whole thing, like the fun of it and the looseness of it. And it was, for me, like a
completely different response than a acoustic piano.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was great to spend time, learning how a Wurlitzer works differently than an organ or a piano, because each keyboard has such a different playing style that's required, So that was kind of when I started wrapping my head around the Whirly.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
And had you played any like Hammond at that point?
No. The first time I ever laid eyes on a Hammond was years later in a recording studio in North Carolina when I was in a band called DAG, which was like a funk band. But so the short version of the story that got me there is that I worked at Columbia Records in New York.
Oh yeah, I saw that. You had an A&R gig?
Yeah, I did. Well, I was like an assistant in the department, but it was.
How did that come about?
Nepotism. There was a guy.
Oh yeah.
There was a guy who had graduated from my college who was an A&R director at Columbia Records. Shortly after, they were just in the process of like. Merging with Sony, like so. I started off. It was interesting because I got to see the CBS building. So I graduated from college with a degree in classical piano, like in '92.
Okay.
And then, but I just wanted to move to New York and like have fun, and so I did that. And I worked at a hospital in Harlem for a minute, and then I got a job at Columbia because there was this guy named Michael Galelli who was a graduate of Vassar. And the funny thing, though, was that he hired me and then almost immediately got fired because that's the way the music business.
That's the story of every music person that I ever met that had a job in the 80s and 90s. It's
so
this great guy at the label, and then he got fired.
Totally. And so I was just lucky that like somebody else wanted to work with me as the assistant, and so I ended up like working with a guy named Josh Sarabin, who both these guys changed my life, and a guy named Mike Corbett, who were both so for every two directors, A&R, like talent scout guys, there would be one admin person that would help out. And the one guy I worked for, Mike, was an old childhood friend of the head of the label. And so we, on that side of things, were working with Mariah Carey and George Michael when he was suing Sony. And it was like he got the difficult ones because Mariah Carey was married to Tommy Mottola at the time, who was everybody's boss, and there was so much corruption. Oh my God. And
did you see some of that in action?
Oh my God, yeah.
Like what?
So like, yeah. So one day I was at my office in New York, and my job was to answer the phones too. And there was a guy, Mariah Carey's manager at the time was a guy named Randy Hoffman, who had been best man at her wedding to Tommy Mottola. And the word in the office was that, like, Mottola's first wife was the one who was really mobbed up. And people made jokes in the office about how Mariah Carey was going to get her kneecaps busted, like only half kidding, I remember reading that book, Hitman, at my desk because I thought I was doing like a good job and like I wanted to learn about the company, and a kind-hearted like dude like who was another director of A&R, he was like, put that shit away. What are you doing? You're going to get, I was like, what? I'm like learning about like Columbia Records. And he was like, do not read that here. Like, what are you thinking?
That's for anyone that's listening, that is a book that sort of exposes the 80s record in 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s corruption in that.
Yeah, specifically at Columbia, which is where I was. So anyway, like one day, like Randy Hoffman calls up the office and he was like, Jen, it's Randy Hoffman. You've been doing a great job with Mariah. I want you to come to my office and have lunch with me and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to talk about how you can take on more responsibility, with the Mariah thing. And I was like, oh my God, that's so great. Cause I'm the girl from Kansas. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have lunch with Mariah Carey's manager and like doing a good job. I'm making it in New York. And, and so I tell my boss, like Mike Corbett, it's like, Randy Hoffman, he invited me to lunch. I'm going to go have lunch with him. And Mike goes, I'm going to come with you to that lunch. And I was like, great, that'll be so fun. We'll probably eat some good food because you guys have so much money and like whatever. So we go together to Randy's office and we walked in we weren't like a foot inside the door when Mike laid into Hoffman and was like, you motherfucker, you leave her out of your bullshit. I know what you're doing and you don't do that to this young girl. She's got no idea what you're doing and blah, blah, blah. You leave her out of it. Fuck up, blah, blah, blah. Jen, we're getting out of here. And so he turns around and I was like,
you must have been shocked.
I had no clue what was happening.
Well, I mean, what was happening?
So what was happening was that Mariah Carey was in the studio making a record that would become the Music Box record. Yeah. She was working at I can't believe I'm saying that. I guess there's nobody around like to
I think we're far enough removed from those days that you're not going to get kneecapped after this.
Anyway, like there was a studio called the Hit Factory that was notoriously like mobbed up. And so she was recording there. And from what I understand, like they were overcharging the label and like basically laundering money.
Right.
And because nobody at the label at that time would say no to an expense incurred by everybody's boss's wife. Because at the time, Mottola was the head of Sony Music Entertainment, like all the labels and all the film, everything.
Whoa.
So he's like very powerful.
He's God.
Yeah. And so Hoffman was going to have, so he was going to have me approve like the supposed studio expenses coming in from Mariah Carey's record, so that if the DA ever came like looking for like where all this money is like going, my name would have been on all of the invoices.
So you were like the stooge.
I would have been the stooge, and so my boss saved me from having my name all over this completely like shady stuff. I had no idea that this is what was going. There's just one of like a bunch of examples. It was like kind of the tail end of that like real wild time.
Yeah.
And
were they like crazy opulent offices and stuff that you were working in? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
they were.
I mean, I was just sitting in the hallway outside of the office, but the guys who were in charge had like really nice things. And, kind of like, it was just like, I mean, we drank and smoked cigarettes at our desks, and like, it was wild. There was a fax that came in one time for a recording session for an artist named Terrence Trent D'Arby. Do you remember him? He requested hookers to be at the recording session, and it like on the rider, you know what I mean? For like
just flagrantly.
I mean, it was like nuts and fun. We would go like to hear music all the time because it was part of my job, of course, to like, as a very young person, same thing as today, like the way that people hire college students because what they really want to do is like find out what college students like. And so that was me, at 22, I was.
Did you like it?
I loved it. Yeah.
Like, did you see a future
no, because like there was a very clear delineation between people who were on track to like be talent scouts. And also, here's what really happened. Is that Darden Smith called. Okay, so the guy that I worked for named Mike Corbett, a bunch of things were happening at the same time. The one director I was working for signed a band called Cry of Love, which is how I met Freed. Featuring Audley Freed, which is how I met him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I'm meeting the love of my life, at the same time. And the other guy, my other boss, Mike, was really technically savvy, and he was working directly with is it DigiDesign was the name, I think, of the software company at the time that was developing the very first Pro Tools.
Yeah, it's DigiDesign.
So he was the guy at the label at the time that was doing the radio edits, like using Pro Tools. And I remember him tuning Mariah Carey's voice on a recording. And I couldn't believe it. And so this was in 1992, so it was like really early on with this technology. Yeah. And I remember watching him draw her note,
Right. That's how you did it back then.
Yeah. And I was just like floored. And so he was on the forefront of all that. So they asked him to do the radio edits. And so he was doing that. And so he would...
The radio edits of the singles?
Yeah. Okay. So he had started doing that for the label. And one day I was sitting at my desk and this wonderful singer-songwriter named Darden Smith called up and started cussing a blue streak. And he, blah, 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 blah. He was so angry, I couldn't understand.
At who?
Well, I was on the receiving end of it at the first. He was like, "What the fuck did you do to my music? How dare you? Blah, 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 blah."
Oh, there was an edit.
Well, I didn't know what he was talking about. So I passed him through to Mike, and it turned out, so they had done an edit of one of his songs and sent it to radio without telling him.
Whoa.
Okay. And so he was justifiably really pissed off. Mm-hmm. And that was the moment that I was like, you know what? It's really fun to have all these free dinners and stuff, but I am on the wrong end of the stick here. I am one of the bad guys.
That's interesting that you realized that.
Yeah. And in that moment I was like, I'm getting out of here. And so I applied to graduate schools and moved to Seattle.
And you just quit?
I quit. Yeah.
Wow.
I quit. And I'm really glad that I did. But I kept the boy, and it's 30 years later and he's still.
Did you guys hook up at that point?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I was 23 when we met, and he was living in North Carolina at the time. And so we were long distance, a year while I was living in New York and he was in North Carolina. And then 2 more years while I was in grad school in Seattle and he was in North Carolina. And then finally.
That's far.
Yeah. It's about as far as you can get. And still be in the United States. And and then one of the really important things that happened, I guess, when I was working at the label was that I used vacation days because one of the bands that I really loved that my boss had signed was called DAG, and they were making a record in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And I used vacation days and scraped together money to buy myself a plane ticket to Florence, Alabama, and went and watched the recording session that this band was doing. So that was the first time I was ever in a full-on, I had been in smaller studios in Manhattan.
Yeah.
But that was the first time I had been in a big room.
Was it Fame or was it Muscle Shoals Sound, or which one was it?
It was the one on the river. It was Muscle Shoals Sound on the river, the location wasn't the original.
Right. It hadn't moved yet.
Yeah. It's where that film studio is now, or whatever it is.
But it was all the were the small presence.
Roger Hawkins was there. Still
because they sort of ran the studio.
He did, yeah. So I met all those guys, and Dag was like a funk band, and so that we were staying in a river house. I mean, it was just it was incredible. And
you weren't playing?
No, I just went there because I wanted to see them, and I wanted to see how a record was made. And they didn't know I played piano, and they were in the one studio, I can't remember if they were in A or B, but anyway, there was a grand piano in the empty other room where they were not recording. And when you're like 23 and broke, you don't get to play grand pianos very often when you live in New York City. And so I was like, oh my God, this is like a Steinway. So I went into the other room without telling anybody and like went and started playing like some Chopin or something.
Yeah.
And the producer of the band that was having a record come out on Columbia came into the room and was like, what the hell? Like you're like the girl who's like the assistant to our A&R guy coming here like playing Chopin. And I was like, well, yeah, I used to play music and, you know, because I'd pretty much like given up.
Who was the producer? Was it anyone you know?
He was this guy named John Custer who produced the Dag record and the Cry of Love record that Audley made. He was like a, you know, local guy in Raleigh. And so it got on their radar that I played. Okay. And so I went back home, wonderful like time hanging out in Muscle Shoals, great adventures. And then...
It's such a magical town, eh? Oh my God. I was just there.
Still,
like,
yeah. There's some juju happening down there now, too. Yeah. Like cool things happening in that area. Yeah, always has been. And I found out later that the piano that I played was probably the same piano that Billy Powell played when Leonard Skinner discovered that he played a little classical piano.
That's
and,
right.
Like could like
shred.
Yeah. And I only learned that really recently. So like the same thing happened to me like 30 years later.
So
on the same piano.
You joined that band.
Eventually I did, yes. And so they figured out that day that I could play. And then I went off to graduate school for a little while. And then as I was finishing my master's degree, I got a call from the guitar player in Dag. And he said, our keyboard player quit. Would you like to drop out of your PhD program and move to Raleigh and get in the van with us? And I said, yes.
Really?
So that's exactly what I wanted to do. Yeah. So I dropped out of grad school and moved to North Carolina and moved in with Audley, which was another.
Oh, so that was part of the appeal too. It was a way to get there.
Yeah, a way to get to North Carolina. Yeah.
And so you moved there for a while.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we were there for 6 or 7 years together. Yeah.
And what was that band like? Were you touring all over the place with that band, or was it?
Yeah,
it was,
yeah. They so I worked their first record on the A&R side in New York, and then I played on their second record that came out on Columbia.
And that was your first session?
I think I played on a Cry of Love, on the second Cry of Love album, briefly, and I might have played on the first Dag record, just like hand claps or something. But yeah, the second Dag record was the first record that I made.
And what were you playing?
All kinds of. There was a Hammond B3 in the studio.
Like you can't just sit down at a Hammond as a piano player and like play it. It's a whole different beat. I mean, you can, but it's a whole different repertoire of stuff.
That's right. Well, and I was lucky in that there was another keyboard player. They actually hired 2 keyboard players for that second record because it was so keyboard heavy. They'd used a bunch of Oberheims and a bunch of piano and a bunch of all kinds of stuff. And so they had 2 of us. And the other guy, the guy who was the other keyboard player in the band was a guy named Kai Russell, who was from Minneapolis, maybe, and he was a great organ player, and so he helped to show me like some stuff. He was like a jazz guy, so he had like a great facility. I learned a lot from him,
like how to work the Leslie,
and the drawbars, and he had like a whole like volume pedal thing that I remember he would practice like doing, and I was fascinated by all of that. And
so on that record, though, you play Hammond.
He played most of the Hammond. Like I played more like, I sang back up and played piano and synth stuff. Yeah.
How was that experience for you? Like, did you enjoy the process of making that record?
I loved parts of it. But sadly, there were like already dynamics starting in the band. Like, really? That made it a little like
the writing was on the wall.
Yeah, it was a little bit on the wall. And so there was like, they were like elements of it that were already kind of falling apart. But I did love like the studio, you know. I did love making music.
Yeah. You toured with those guys, like that was a thing.
Yeah.
And it was like hardcore band, rock and roll.
Yeah.
How big was the band?
I think we were pretty damn good. Yeah, there's still people in Nashville that like remember that band. Yeah, they were.
I missed that band.
It was fun, and for, you know I think we didn't have the song really, but it was kind of in the vein of like. Do you remember Jamiroquai?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. It kind of had like that kind of vibe to it.
Yeah. Like some funk and some soul and some.
Yeah. The players were great. The singer guy played bass, and Bobby Patterson was his name. He's like fantastic, and so it was that part of it was great, and I learned that I love touring.
So that band broke up, obviously.
Yeah.
Fairly soon after that.
Yeah.
And then what? And then that.
And then the guy that I worked for at Columbia knew that the Jayhawks were looking for a keyboard player, and so he recommended me for the audition.
The other keyboard player, what was her name?
Karen Grotberg.
And she had just quit, right?
Well, she basically went on maternity leave. She had a baby and didn't want to tour, and so they wanted somebody to join for the tour, and so I did that. And
did you know the band at all?
Well, I had been a fan of Hollywood Town Hall and had heard all of their records. Like when I was working at Columbia, I really liked their stuff. I remember the manager calling me, or I was talking to the manager on the phone, and she asked if I needed her to send the music so I could learn it. And I was like, no, I've got all the records. I love it. You know, I was a fan and very grateful to get to play with them.
Tell me about when you show up for a gig like that. Like, it seems like you already knew their music, so you didn't have to put in a ton of extra work probably. But
oh, well, I do. I'm a homework doing person.
I know you are.
I did a lot of work for that.
Okay.
I was
you
nervous.
showed up like fully like
I did my homework. Yeah. Okay. I wanted the gig.
Yeah. And was what you had prepared what they were looking for?
Well, I got the gig, and I think that they weren't used to, like, Benmont Tench had played on at least one of their records, and I had learned all of the Benmont parts note for note. And I think that
pretty good parts.
Because they're great. And I think that Karen, because she was a member of the band, you know, like, did what she wanted to do with when she was performing with them. So I'm not sure she was as married to the Benmont parts as I came in and I did it exactly like Benmont because I thought it was cool.
Sure.
And I think when I went in, they were like, oh, yeah, that's how that went.
So that was like 97, 98 kind of thing?
More like, I think 99, 2000, 2001, like around there.
Okay.
Because I was in DAG like the late 90s and then...
Yeah. And how long did the Jayhawks thing last for?
About 2 years.
You played on Smile or you didn't play on Smile?
I didn't play on Smile.
Because there's there's a credit thing where you are and then there's other credits where you're not.
Record. So here's exactly what happened. I'm glad to have a chance to clear this up. So Karen played everything on Smile. I played nothing. She deserves all the credit, and she's awesome. By the time they did the album artwork, I had already been playing with the band. And so they were like, come on and do the photo shoot with us. And I should have said no. And if I had it to do over again, I would say no, thank you. But at the time, I was like, yay, I'm in the band. I'm doing a photo shoot. I get to go to New Orleans where it's warm and eat a bunch of oysters. And so I took the free plane ticket and I did the photo shoot. And then my picture ended up on the album. And it just was not...
It felt weird.
It was not good. Like, I shouldn't have been on that.
I don't know. I mean, you were in the band.
She should have been on the artwork.
Right. So that's how you ended up, like, in some versions. I think even All Music, it says you play on that record.
Yeah, I did not. All Music.
You didn't play on a single thing?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
But you toured that record, obviously.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you didn't play on later records of theirs, did you?
Oh, well, now I'm confused. Smile. No, wait a minute.
Smells like what, '02 maybe?
Whatever the record was before Smile, that's the one that I accidentally got on the album artwork.
Okay.
And then they fired me before they went in to record Smile. So
you got fired?
Yeah.
Why did you get fired?
My friends say that I was actually downsized because what happened was like 9/11 happened, frankly, is what happened. And so there was a period of time where they had some gigs and I couldn't get there because I was living in North Carolina the whole time and they're based in Minneapolis.
Right.
And so I think that they decided to save money and just like not have a keyboard player for a little while.
Right. And
then Karen came back and I think, you know what, but like it hurt my feelings at the time, but like I'm so grateful that they fired me because I don't think I would have necessarily, because they were so good and they had such cachet and it was such a cool thing to do. I'm not sure I would have had the cojones to quit, you know, and not being in that band turned out to be like fantastic because it led to everything else. It opened up time and space for me to do all the other things. And
I guess like being in the Jayhawks had a lot of cachet at that point too, right? Like
yeah.
They were they were probably even a little past their peak of popularity, I guess, right? At that point?
Well, I don't know if they would want to be thought of that way, but yeah, it was a heady
They definitely
time.
had like a trajectory that yeah.
Well, and, you know, Audley was in the Black Crowes at the time, too. So, you know, he was in the Crowes and I was in the Jayhawks and both bands toured really heavily and it was heady, you know. Yeah. People were still partying and, like...
What was the touring situation like? Like, you were on buses and planes and stuff, like...
Yeah. Some vans, but mostly a bus.
Was it rock clubs, or were you playing big theaters, or what was
some theaters, I remember, in big rock clubs, like, yeah. So it was, like, pretty, like, rough, you know. These guys, like, were living hard at the time. And there was even, it was rock and roll, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did that work for you? Like, did you dig it? Or was it just like, oh my God, what's going on here?
I think I was like naive. Like, I didn't really realize all the things that were going on. And I don't know. I'm a person that sometimes like, I think I'm sometimes deliberately naive. Like, I just sort of sometimes don't see what I don't want to see, which I, you know, get from my dad. But, yeah, I mean, I really liked playing that music and I knew that it was good and I was very proud to be a part of it.
Yeah.
But it was not healthy for me to be in that band.
Were you boozing and whatever else?
Yeah, I never really did drugs. I mean, but I probably drank too much, and those guys were definitely partying and doing all kinds of stuff. Like, yeah.
Mostly in the States, or like were you touring all over the world with them?
Yeah, all over. We had some really fun times in Spain. There was a promoter over there that took us over there. And I think they still go over there. I think they do well. We spent like months at a time, or like a month in Spain, like 2 separate times.
Wow! So you're seeing the world. You're playing rock and roll.
Yeah. It was really fun.
And were you hauling a Hammond around? You probably were, right, in those days?
They had like a it's called an X5 or something. It's like it was like one of those that you could unscrew the legs, you know, and like
almost chopped.
Yeah, like and then, something like that.
So you had an organ station. Did you have a Whirly too? And were you bringing a piano with you?
Not a real piano.
What did you use in those days?
Like 25 years ago. I can't really remember. There
wasn't really a great sounding electric like a synth thing or anything.
I think it was a Roland A90. I think that's what I had.
For a piano sound.
Yeah, I think I had a Roland.
Okay. And what about a Whirly? Did you have a real Whirly, or did you have a?
I think the Roland had a okay Whirly in it.
Okay, because that was a big part of their. It was like you kind of had to have the Whirly and the organ and the piano.
There may have been a real Wurlitzer for a minute too that belonged to the band, but the Roland was mine. I'm pretty sure it was a Roland for the piano sounds.
Did the X5 or whatever, did it have a a Leslie effect, or did you have a Leslie?
I think there was a real Leslie.
Okay.
Like, honestly, my memory's a little foggy.
You had
it was a good setup. Yeah, it sounded good.
You had a road crew and everything, right?
There were 2 guys. God bless them.
Okay. That's a lot, yeah. Because the band was 6?
5,
5?
6.
Okay, and then, and a couple road.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a big old traveling circus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was like 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then that ended abruptly.
Yes.
And were you kind of crushed, or like how did that affect you?
I didn't like it. No, I was a good girl and I did not like it. And I was used to like, doing a job. I like to think of myself as a person who did a good job and like worked hard and, and I didn't, it hurt. And, but the great thing was that I was living in Raleigh at the time, and Caitlin Carey had just had Whiskey Town had just kind of like stopped being a thing.
Yeah.
And so she was making a solo record, and I started working in a studio with Chris Stamey. I don't know if you're aware of his stuff.
He's a producer?
Yeah, he's an awesome producer and musician. He was in a band called the DBs and is part of that Mitch Easter, like North Carolina indie rock.
This is a world wonderful. I do not know much about.
They're great. And so I started making records for Chris Stamey with Caitlin and with other people down there.
Yeah.
And so I toured for a couple of years with Caitlin as well, and had a really that was the first time I was ever on the road with another woman. Mm-hmm. And it was
that a little more chill than the traveling circus of the
Yes. Okay. It was way less debauched and
full band or just the 2 of you?
There was sometimes a full band and sometimes 3 of us. There was a guy named Dave Bartholomew who could play like all the instruments, and so he would sometimes be the third one of the trio. But we also had like a full band for a good bit of the time too.
And were you kind of getting the itch to do more studio stuff at this point?
Yeah. I still don't think I kind of realized that I'm just blown away by kids who come to Nashville and they're like, I want to be a session player. Like I didn't know that was a job that you could have for the longest time. I just thought you had to be in a band and get to make a record every once a year or something, Yeah. But were
people starting to call you? I guess he was.
Jamie started to call, yeah. Okay. And I started working like with him. And then that was right around the time that Audley started doing session work here. And so he had the idea that we should move to Nashville. And I remember I didn't want to go because my only like knowledge of Nashville was that it was the place where people never showed up to your gigs. Like when I was in the Jayhawks, we'd be like, screw Nashville, because like we would play in Knoxville and it'd be kick-ass. We'd play in Atlanta, it'd be kick-ass. You come to Nashville.
It's still like that.
No, right. And at the time I was like, people must be so jaded in Nashville. But now I understand that it's because it's an embarrassment of riches, and like there's free stuff every single night that like, you can see world-class people.
Yeah.
So now anyway, now I understand. But it was around that time that Audley was like, we should move to Nashville. We could do more studio work. Mm-hmm. We could maybe sleep in our own bed more often. We could maybe see each other more often, because like we had both been in separate touring.
He was done with Black Rose at that point.
I don't recall. I don't remember. He had a whole series of like gigs, like for years. He was like, Peter Frampton, the Dixie Chicks,
right.
like the Black Crowes. So for a while he was doing all that stuff. But yeah, we moved here with the hopes that we could get into more studio work and be more in a community of people.
And did that happen right away?
No, not right away. But he was more of a known entity, and so he kind of came to town like with a resume that people knew. I think I came in and had a really different path to sort of finding my way, because I didn't have that same. He had been a lot more successful than me, and so I started saying yes to all of the singer-songwriter gigs. And like that was how I kind of got my footing here in Nashville, is like saying yes to everybody and playing at, all of the, a lot at the Family Wash and a lot at like,
Oh yeah, that was sort of your haunt there for a while, right?
Yeah, it really was. And 12th and Porter and 3rd and Lindsley, and
was the basement a thing at that point?
The basement, and just like a ton of singer-songwriter gigs, which was and Douglas Corner was open at that time, so a bunch of gigs there.
Were you able to make a living doing that, or like that's just like those gigs don't pay that?
They do not pay very much. No, we did not have a lot of money, but also when we moved to Nashville, I planned to teach piano lessons, which is something I had done in between touring before. Yeah. And I couldn't find like a room. So I had sent out a bunch of like resumes and cover letters. And as a last resort, I sent out a resume and cover letter to the dean of the music school at Vanderbilt. Yeah. And he answered. He was the only one who answered. Like, I'd sent them out everywhere. Yep. And he reached out and was like, that was the strangest cover letter and resume I think I've ever received in my life. I'd like to sit down and speak with you. I was like, great. And so we sat down and hit it off. His name is Mark Waite, and he's retired now from being the dean at the music school, but he at the time was looking to expand the curriculum and offer more classes in like pop music history. Yeah. And he asked me if I wanted to develop a course for them. And so I started teaching there in fall of 2004, 20 years ago.
And you still do it to this day?
Today.
Amazing. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so that helped. Although,
right. Yeah.
I love Vanderbilt, but they did not pay me very much money when I first started out there.
Really?
It was, adjunct like work is like.
Oh, really?
No, it's terrible money. So we were broke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did working with all the singer-songwriters lead to what you were hoping, like more session work?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because then, hopefully they ask you to make the record with them, and then, you meet the engineers and the producers who are the people who know the other people, and, one thing leads to another.
Totally.
And,
that's how it goes around here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about the Sheryl Crow gig, so that you've been playing with her for
10 years now. Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah. More than 10, yeah.
What was going on in your life at that point when you got that call?
I remember I was at the basement playing a gig with Adam and Shannon Wright when I picked up my cell phone to check messages, and Sheryl had called. And so what happened was that Audley and the rest of the guys in Nashville got that gig with her before I did, and they were, because she had done this country music record, and her band that she'd had for many, many years were off doing other things, and
she was living here.
She was living here, right?
And it was a little more local for her.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, so she wanted to get like players who were in town, and Audley and I knew her sister and her then husband, because they were part of the Family Wash like crowd,
Okay.
And so I'd never met Sheryl, but I knew her sister Kathy, who was awesome. And I think Kathy recommended me to Sheryl, but also Audley already had the gig. And the funny thing was that
had somebody quit or left, or this was like she was just trying to get a Nashville crew, and
so. Originally, the band included a guy named Josh Grange who plays keyboards and also pedal steel. Yeah. And so he was covering both things, but then she decided she wanted a dedicated keyboard player, basically, about a year into the thing, so that he could focus on, he's a multi-instrumentalist and can do anything. And so, so she decided she wanted a dedicated keyboard player. And I think she wanted a female background vocalist too. Right. And so, I was a bit of a known entity at that point because of her sister, but also because I had been around, while Audley and the guys, had been playing with her for a year already. Yeah. And it was funny though, because she apparently pulled everybody aside, and because the history of married couples in rock and roll bands is not a very happy one, So she asked the other guys if it would be okay with him if she asked Audley's wife to join. And then she asked Audley if it would be okay with him if she asked me to join.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that they all felt like they couldn't say no, but hopefully they were genuine when they said yes. And, or when they said yes, it would be okay. But Audley and I secretly made a pact that if, like, because we never toured together. We'd been together already at that point for 20 years, and we'd never toured together.
Wow.
And so we made a pact that since I was the last one to join, that I would quit if it was bad for our marriage, for us both to be in Sheryl's band. But thankfully, we still like each other, and we've had the gig together for a long time.
That's crazy. I mean, that's like a really great touring situation.
It's an excellent touring situation.
It's not like you're slogging it out for months on end in a bus or anything. Like you're
right. No, we're very well taken care of. She treats her people beautifully, which is like borne out by the fact that, like, you know, she's got all the same people around her. I mean, she's got the same management, the same tour manager, same guitar tech. You know, like people stay with that gig because it's a good one.
So when you started, did you again like show up like totally prepared? Like she's got a huge catalog of bands.
Yes, I did a lot of homework.
Yeah.
And she's so awesome though that we did not even rehearse.
Really?
I just played a gig with her in Las Vegas.
Oh my God.
And just like
That's
thrown
terrifying.
in the deep end. And it was
is she intimidating to sing backups for? Because
yes.
she's like one of the great backup singers too, right?
Right. And one of the great just singers. I love, she's
like she knows how to sing backup.
Talk about like Aretha Franklin being like underrated, even though she's like so well known. I feel like Sheryl is also still underrated as a musician. She's just like, her choices are so great. And I've been so thankful to have to try to match her, like, because I'm not, I've become a better singer trying to sing like her, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's been great school, you know, to try to match her.
Yeah. Yeah. So what if some of the highlights, you told me about, like, we did a session here and you had just done the Crossroads festival with her.
Yeah.
Are there a few highlights of, I mean, there must be a lot of highlights, but what are some of the most memorable gig situations playing with her over the last 10 years?
Oh, man. Hollywood Bowl, you know, with an orchestra, Farm Aid, you know, having Willie sit in with us. She took me to go see the Rolling Stones, and I got to meet Mick Jagger.
Did you really?
No, I'm sorry, Keith Richards. I met Mick Jagger.
Even cooler.
Yeah. Tons. I don't know where. I don't know where to. It's still going. You know, she's just Bonnaroo a couple times.
Yeah, she's got a pretty remarkable. She's at a really cool stage in her career.
Yeah. She's done. You know, when I first joined, both Jay Leno and David Letterman were still on the air, and so I got to do those shows.
Oh, amazing.
Which was amazing. So we've gotten to do like a bunch of that TV stuff, and that's been interesting. Super cool to see backstage at the Colbert Report. Like, that was very interesting. And
what weird secrets are there about those kind of gigs where, like, for as a musician, that you either wouldn't have known beforehand or that were kind of like surprising or
the TV stuff?
Yeah. Like some of like those, particularly those late night shows. The only ones I've ever done were during COVID, so I wasn't actually there.
Oh, right.
I did a bunch with Ali Russell, but it was all done here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, okay, so the 30 Rock building is where a lot of those shows tape, and some of the floors share like with other shows. And so when you do the Tonight Show, it's on the same floor as like it used to be Seth Meyers, and now I think Kelly Clarkson is on the same floor, and on the same floor with
like happening at the same time too.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you might run into to anybody. And so, for example, we were doing, who would it have been? It might have been Seth Meyers, and See, now I'm getting my floors confused. But anyway, like Saturday Night Live is on the same floor also with another television show, and now I'm getting them confused. But like one time we were there to do some other thing, and Paul McCartney was doing Saturday Night Live.
Oh my God.
And so he was like, so Robert Kearns ran into him in the bathroom, like that kind of stuff. And like the Tonight Show is super magical because that floor, I believe, it's the 6th floor and the 8th floor, or I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, are where like a bunch of those shows get taped. Mm-hmm. And back in the 60s, so I'm a child of like the Muppets and Sesame Street and everything. And so back in the 60s, when Jim Henson was first starting out, he was going to be interviewed in like 1963 or something. So before Sesame Street started, he was a young man who was just starting to like make puppets and like do a thing. And he came to be interviewed on the Jack Parr show in 63. I think it was, and they put him like in a utility area, like closet type thing, to wait for Mr. Parr for a really long time. And there was like maybe some construction or something that was going on. But anyway, long story short, Jim Henson and Frank Oz and like his people turned a bunch of the pipes like behind the wall that were exposed into Muppets. And so to this day, like if you go and you play the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, like there's a whole like wing, or there's like a little area, like a cubby, where there's like a tribute to Jim Henson, and you can still see the pipes that he and his team like turned into. They painted them, and they stuck like fur on the pipes, and so like there's this like Jim Henson like, you know, beautiful. It's magic. It's like incredible. Oh, so stuff like that. Yeah.
Was the Letterman show? I heard it was really cold.
It was freezing. Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
And the other thing, like I saw you guys. I've seen you play a few times with Sheryl, and it really comes across as like a really solid, great rock band. Like you guys, like that's how it translates. It doesn't seem like a bunch of session players or like timid.
Yeah.
It just seems like a great rock band. When you do those TV shows that have to be super controlled, are you compromising like your usual like volume and intensity and stuff, or are you just playing kind of as you normally would?
Well, to your point about it feeling like a rock band, like I think part of the reason for that is that there's like so many connections inside the band that predate Sheryl. Like, so to sidetrack for a second. So of course, Audley and I are like in the band, but then also Robert Kearns, who was in Cry of Love with Audley, is in the band. They've known each other. They've been playing music together for 40 years. Yeah. Fred Eltringham is a drummer in the band, was in the Dixie Chicks with Audley and had been playing music with him for years. I mean, our family, we have spent holidays together with like Robert and Fred's family, like for way years back. Before Sheryl, you know. And Peter Stroud, who's the music director for Sheryl and has been for like 30 some years.
What does he play?
The guitar player. He's like Peter. Has known Audley also for like 35 or 40 years or something like that, from like the Southeastern like guitar guy circuit from like way back in the day. So there's like, one day I'm going to do a Venn diagram that like with all the different bands that everybody's played in even before we came to Sheryl World. So yeah, so it's like real tight knit. But to answer your question, I think those guys are like pretty, I mean, stage volume in general is like way less than what it used to be. So it doesn't. Is
Audley still playing amps on stage?
Yeah, thank God. Okay. Yeah.
And you're playing amps, or are you playing all through other DI situations?
So I have a Wurlitzer that goes into like a little Fender amp and has a distortion pedal and a wah on it for different stuff. And then I have a B3 with a Leslie that is kind of behind me, so I can hear that a little bit, like, you know, in.
Oh, you're touring with a B3.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
it belongs to Sheryl. It's totally tricked out. It's like a beautiful
Really?
B3. So yeah, so my rig has like a B3 and a Leslie.
I
And
didn't know you were screwing with all that stuff.
yeah, it's fun as hell. Yeah, it's really fun. So
And
B3,
you don't have to carry it.
and I don't have to carry it because we have more than 2 crew people.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for those men and women. And then a Nord stage, that has like the samples and the strings and the pianos and the other stuff.
Do you carry a shell of an upright? Okay, I remember seeing that. Yeah.
There was a guy.
And you put like a Nord in the piano part of the. Okay.
Yeah. So
Looks
it doesn't
cool.
look quite terrible. It's terrible. Yeah.
What are the other hallmarks of a gig like that? Like at that level, that's not a level that I'm familiar with. Like, are you aware of what you're doing a year out or like 2 months out, or like how committed do you have to make yourself to that situation?
Pretty committed. Like,
Yeah.
we don't know all the time what's happening ahead of time. Things come up at the last minute.
They do?
Yeah, for sure.
Like big crazy things, or just
like a few months ago, when Donald Fagen got sick and Steely Dan had to drop out of an opening slot for the Eagles in Colorado, they called Sheryl and we flew like with less than 24 hours notice to Denver, I think, and like played at the Enormo Dome, like whatever, that the Eagles were playing. So so everybody in the camp dropped everything and flew to Colorado to open for the Eagles, because I was going to say no to that. Like,
yeah.
But it was a good adventure. It was really fun.
And you have to do that, or I mean, you obviously want to do that too. But like, what if you had another gig? What would you do?
Well, I would have had to bail on the
other gig,
probably.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, which is not a fun part of the job. I want to be reliable and consistent.
Do you have to make concessions for that kind of thing? Like if I called you and said, hey, I have a session in July, would you be able to say, that would be unusual for me to ask you to do that because I don't really plan that far ahead, but like, would you have to say, I can't do that?
Well, I hope what I try to do is say I would love to do it, and it looks like Sheryl's calendar is free, and I would like to say yes if you're okay with the fact that it's possible that something would come and like blow it out of the water later. So that's the way I kind of do it.
Is it pretty normal to kind of know what you're doing like 6 months out in that world?
The big structures are there right now. So I know like the big structures of what's happening for the rest of the year, for example. Like we're pretty much here for the next few months, and then in June we're going to Europe, and then July is like looks pretty open, and then it gets like to be a bit of a question mark because from August to the end of the year we're opening up for Pink.
Really? Oh my God, that'll be nuts.
I feel foolish that I did not know until like this year that she's a stadium act. Like, didn't know that. Like, I mean, I knew she was big, but I didn't know she was that. Anyway, so we're gonna do that, and what the question marks are because there's like a 250-mile radius clause around the Pink shows, but also because of her trapeze stuff and everything that she does, or maybe because of her voice, but for whatever reason, she is 1 day on and 2 days off.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so it's a bit like Sheryl world, like she works.
Likes to rock. She likes to go.
She goes, and does not take many days off. And so I don't really know like how often we'll be coming home on those 2 days.
Oh, wow. That's a little awkward. Yeah.
So hopefully I'll get more information about that soon.
That would be a bus situation, or
I don't know.
Okay. There's a lot of flying with Sheryl.
Probably a lot of flying for these. And because it's the fall, because you get to the point where you can like make some educated guesses. Sheryl's an extremely dedicated parent. And so my guess is that she's going to want to go home as often as possible because her kids will be in school because they're still school age.
Okay. Yeah.
But I don't really know. Like
that's a guess at best.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. So she has a new record coming out soon. Did you play on that record?
No.
Okay.
No, she hired a guy named Mike Elizondo.
I love Mike Elizondo.
Yeah, and so he has his own like stable of people that he
Right.
likes to work with.
Yeah.
So that was the deal with that.
Is that disappointing for you as a keyboard player? I mean,
Sure,
I don't
yeah,
wanna, like, put words in your mouth, but like,
Yeah, but also Sheryl is a brilliant keyboard player,
Right.
and since day one has played almost all of the keyboards on all of her records, and so I understand that she can do whatever she hears. Like she's a very good keyboard player. And when I have played on her records,
like, has she got organ chops and stuff too?
she can play anything.
She can,
like,
yeah.
She really can. She's really good, and so you know. What am I going to say? I mean, she's Sheryl, and she plays like brilliantly, and so you know that's the way that's structured because she's really good and she can play her own stuff.
Have you heard the new record?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Have I heard all of it?
It must be cool. I love Mike Elizondo's
stuff.
stuff.
We worked out some of it at rehearsals this past week because we went on the West Coast and did some TV and shows just this past week.
Is that kind of the only time you rehearse? Because you guys are a pretty tight machine. Like new record rehearsals come up, and that's
exactly work up the new songs. We didn't rehearse the old songs because we've been playing them long.
And then when she puts out a record, is it gangbusters with touring and like appearances everywhere? And
it has been, and I think she's doing something right now, and like today even maybe like she works. Like she works hard. Yeah.
So if you had to estimate how many shows a year you do with her, what would you say? Like 100?
I don't know. Maybe
something in that department.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
Yeah, she works. She really does. You know, and you kind of learn that about these people. I mean, there's a reason you've heard of them. You know, these people that like.
Well, not everyone works that hard. She works exceptionally hard, I would say.
She works exceptionally hard. Yeah. Don't you think, though, that like the people whose names you've heard all have that kind of like...
a lot of them, yeah. A lot of them do, yeah. Do you ever get like a year off with her?
No.
It's okay. No. There's always stuff going on, even if she's in between records.
Yeah.
And then as far as like your world goes, do you have a bunch of keyboards at home that you... I don't know. Like, do you have organs and whirlies and stuff at home? We
have a pretty small house, and so I don't have a lot of stuff, but I have like some stuff. I don't have a B3, but I do have a Wurlitzer, and I've got a collection of Nors, and I've got a Mellotron, and I've got an upright piano and a grand piano, and like
that's pretty good.
It's tools that I like. I like to get. I played a gig recently. A hilarious gig recently where our buddy Nicole Atkins had this concept of playing like Led Zeppelin covers but dressed as WWE wrestlers. Did you hear about this?
I did not.
It's called Ultimate Zeppelin, and I didn't really understand until I got to the Basement East that like it was serious. You know, there was like a wardrobe room. Anyway, there was a guy there, Daniel Creamer, who had an Oberheim that I coveted, and so I might have to get me like it reminded me of the old DAG days. Like it sounded so good.
Oh, wicked. So if you do a session that needs organ, the studio needs to have an organ.
Yeah, or you know, if it's like the Nord Electros, you know, are okay, you know, for the
they're pretty good. But I can imagine for you as the player, it's not as satisfying.
It's not as fun. No. But there's a lot of B3s around Nashville for sure.
There are, yeah.
You know,
I can't believe how many. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for
thanks for having me. I can't believe it. All the
I don't know how
all
long
the directions we went.
It was we got a big chunk of information there.
Oh man, yeah, it's late. Sorry for talking so much.
No, that's great. Love it.
Thank you for having me. This has really been fun.
Good, thanks. Music Makers and Soul Shakers is a bi-weekly podcast produced at the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You can also find us at makersandShakerspodcast.com. Thanks again to our sponsors this season, Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Hen House Hang. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.